From the studios of KPFK Pacifica Radio in Los Angeles, this is Uprising, and I'm Sonali Kohatkar. It's Wednesday, December 10th, 2014. How the history of U.S. racism is embedded deep into the fabric of the United States. We'll hear from Professor John A. Powell, author of Racing for Justice, as he makes the links between corporate power and black disenfranchisement, the Republican Party, and racist policies. That's coming up after the news. Joining us now to analyze today's headlines is Arun Gupta. He's a journalist and a regular contributor to The Guardian, In These Times, The Progressive, and Truth Out. Hi, Arun.
Hi, Sonali.
The United Nations Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and Counterterrorism has recommended criminal prosecution for high-level Bush administration officials who condoned the CIA's use of torture against detainees in the post-9/11 years. The bold push is based on the release of a 500-plus page executive summary of a report by the Senate Intelligence Committee that both the CIA, Obama administration, as well as former Bush-era officials fought tooth and nail to prevent from making public. Ben Emerson, the UN rapporteur, said, quote, "The individuals responsible for the criminal conspiracy revealed in today's report must be brought to justice and must face criminal penalties commensurate with the gravity of their crimes." President Obama, in a speech following the report's release, made it clear he would rather sweep it all under the rug. The president said, rather than another reason to refight old arguments, "I hope that today's report can help us leave these techniques where they belong, in the past." Now, Arun, is the U.S. left with no choice under international U.S. law but to prosecute based on this report, or will our leaders simply find a way to use arguments of American exceptionalism to say that we are above the law?
I'm not even sure that they'll use arguments. They'll just ignore it. The U.S. Impunity is American as apple pie. I mean, we can just go through the list of wars. The Vietnam War, the Indochina Wars, the Central American Wars, so many of the proxy wars during the Cold War involved just horrific, systematic atrocities, killing of millions of people in Vietnam alone, and no one was ever held accountable for them. What's gone on? You have a president who's waged 8 illegal wars, essentially, in President Obama. So they'll just sweep it all under the rug. There's certainly no call, no clamor for prosecution. And, we saw yesterday the ACLU published an op-ed in the New York Times saying, just pardon them all because that'll send a message that they committed a crime. And I think, unfortunately, that won't happen, but that's probably the most that can be expected of a government that, coddles bankers and cops.
Right. In what may be a short break from a yearly tradition, members of Congress may actually pass a government funding plan. There is still a chance that the looming and recurrent fear of a shutdown will pan out this year, with current funding expiring on Friday at midnight. Negotiators have put together a $1.1 trillion spending plan that mostly keeps in place domestic levels of spending, except for the Department of Homeland Security, whose budget will have to be renegotiated in February. Republicans, who will have a majority in both houses of Congress starting in January, have, through such a move, effectively put off their threat of shutting down the government over President Obama's executive action on immigration. It appears as though it will be among the first orders of business in the new year. Arun, how nice of the GOP to give us something to look forward to in January. I can't wait. Can you?
Oh, no, not at all. I think, though, we need to recognize that already what the Republicans are doing is that they are, as part of this deal, they are cutting environmental regulation, and they're also weakening derivatives trading. So they have a pretty clear agenda, but it's nothing that Obama doesn't very much support as well. I think though the big worry is, of course, on immigration. But we have to understand also that Obama has came out explicitly this week supporting the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which would be absolutely devastating in terms of its effects on U.S. labor and the economy and the environment.
And finally, Time magazine has chosen its Person of the Year, and as it has done occasionally in the past, this year's person is not really a person, but a group of people, the healthcare workers, including doctors and nurses on the front lines of treating victims of Ebola. The magazine justified its choice, saying the rest of the world can sleep at night because a group of men and women are willing to stand and fight for tireless acts of courage and mercy, for buying the world time to boost its defenses, for risking, for persisting, for sacrificing and saving. The Ebola fighters are Time's 2014 Person of the Year. Among the other contenders for the honor were Ferguson protesters and Malala Yousafzai. Arun, do you think this was a good choice?
Well, I think Time magazine has forgotten its own criteria. The Person of the Year was originally meant as the most newsworthy person. So in the past, it had picked people such as Hitler, which was very controversial. But the fact is, he was the most newsworthy person. In terms of who Time is choosing as the Ebola fighters, it's a feel-good choice. No one could dispute that they were incredibly brave, but they, in their selection of the Ebola fighters, Time just completely sweeps under the rug the destruction of the health infrastructure in the underdeveloped world. And you know, I would say, like, what we need to see one of these years is Time magazine picking the state or the financial markets as the Person of the Year. It has picked abstract entities like that before, like the internet, because that is who really has far more influence on the news on a day-to-day basis.
Arun, I want to thank you very much for joining us today. Arun Gupta is a journalist and a regular contributor to The Guardian and These Times, The Progressive, and Truth Out. And also today is Arun's last day as news analyst on a regular basis for Uprising. He's going to be traveling for several months. So Arun, thank you for all the years you've been with us. I know we'll be bringing you back on Uprising as a guest for sure in the future. And thank you and good luck.
Thank you, Sonali. It's been great to be with you.
Arun Gupta again, and I'm sure you will be seeing him in the future on Uprising. This is Uprising, and when we come back, we'll hear from John A. Powell. Stay tuned. Welcome back to Uprising. I'm Sonali Kolhatkar. The epidemic of police killings of unarmed black men seems to have not waned in the least, even if protesters are out on city streets in full force, denouncing police brutality. A 28-year-old unarmed African-American man named Cedric Bartee was fatally shot over the weekend in Orlando, Florida. Sergeant Robert McCarthy of the Orange County Sheriff's Department fired shots at Bartee after locating a stolen car. According to CBS News, quote, law enforcement officials told reporters that Bartee had extensive furtive movements, causing McCarthy to fear for his safety and open fire. But eyewitnesses say they saw Bartee with his hands up in the air begging not to be shot. It's a familiar story to all those outraged at the fact that our law enforcement and criminal justice system seems to be carrying out extrajudicial executions of black men. Protests against police brutality have continued since the weekend as part of a week of rage. From blocking freeways to staging die-ins, activists have attempted to channel their anger into action, pushing officials to do more to stop the killings and hold officers accountable. Today we'll turn to John A. Powell. He's a professor of law and of African American studies and ethnic studies at the University of California, Berkeley, who has taught at numerous law schools, including Harvard and Columbia University. Mr. Powell is the executive director of the Haas Institute for a Fair and Inclusive Society. He's an expert on civil rights and civil liberties and has written extensively on structural racism, racial justice, concentrated poverty, and urban sprawl, voting rights and affirmative action in the U.S., South Africa, and Brazil, as well well as racial and ethnic identity, spirituality, and social justice. His books include In Pursuit of a Dream Deferred and The Rights of Racial Minorities, the Basic ACLU Guide to Racial Minority Rights. His newest book is called Racing to Justice, Transforming Our Concepts of Self and Other to Build an Inclusive Society. Earlier this year, John Powell spoke at an event in Berkeley, organized by KPFA Pacifica Radio. Here is an excerpt of his speech.
But let's think about race and the role of race. And race is a little bit like gravity. And gravity is something that we all have. We all have weight. And yet, by some accounts, and there's my friend Gabor in the audience tonight, there are only about 4 people on the planet that really understand gravity. Yet we all are affected by it. And I would posit that race is like that. We're all affected by it. And we all have sort of a common sense knowledge. I'm an expert in race because I've been black my whole life. Or I'm an expert on race because I'm in an interracial relationship. Or I'm an expert on, really? That's what makes you an expert? You have weight? That's what makes you an expert on gravity? Turns out race is incredibly, incredibly complicated. And even the experts are struggling with it. And there's some experts, whatever that means, in the audience tonight, Ian Handy Lopez, among others. But at least deserves careful thinking and to understand the work it's doing in our society and how it's actually tripping us up in many regards. So Gunther Myrdal, who was a Swedish social scientist, was asked to come over to the United States and study race. He was partially asked to come over and study it because the thought was no one here was objective enough or clear enough to actually study race, even though he assembled a team of people from the United States. And he wrote a book that's a classic called The American Dilemma. And the dilemma was this, according to Myrdal, is a country founded on the concept of equality has deep, systematic racial inequality. That's the dilemma. He called that the American dilemma. And one of the questions is, how do we get to that dilemma? And the other, of course, is, how do we resolve it, if we resolve it at all? So part of the way of thinking about this is, what is race? We talk about race being socially constructed. We almost never, though, take time to think about the actual construction of race. So that's partially what we're going to do this evening. So at the beginning of the colony, race as we know it today didn't exist. There were people from Africa, there were people from Europe, there were people working the fields and the plantations, and they didn't organize their identities or their lives around race. They still had identities, but they didn't organize them around race. And the people working those fields were from Europe and Africa, and they worked together. And based on their practice, they married, they had children. In fact, we're only, even now, not getting back to the level of inter-ethnic, what we now would call racial interaction that was going on in the 17th century. We're not even back there yet. And to them, it made common sense in many ways that they would live together and work together, marry and have children. And they had a rebellion. They had many rebellions. One of the most famous ones called the Bacon Rebellion. And the Bacon Rebellion was actually led by someone who would later be classified as white. The rebellion back then, in 1656, was very similar to our claims today. They were demanding access to the process to become members of societies in the form of citizens. They were actually appealing to the elite, saying we should have a say in our lives. And like a lot of these movements, it was also full of contradictions, because they were saying, look, you've taken all this land from Native Americans, we should get some of it. So the contradiction there, they weren't saying give the land back to the Native Americans. They were saying, you're exploiting the Native Americans, why can't we participate in those spoils? And they were relatively successful in that rebellion. And it scared the elites. And the elites basically said, we have to do something. We can't have all these workers working together, coalescing together, having a rebellion together. And they re-articulated the rebellion as a racial rebellion, or as a rebellion pursued by Africans. And they also, over the next several decades, did something. They actually started pulling whites out of that space. Again, they weren't quite whites yet, or Europeans. And they also deepened the practice of slavery. And they said to these newly minted white folks, you have a role to play. And your role is what some of us call the middle stratum. You're not the elites in society, that's us. But we're going to create a middle stratum. And in that middle stratum, you get to sort of identify with us. You get to wave at us. You don't get to be us, but you get to wave at us. And we're going to create something called slave patrols, where you will patrol the people who last week you were living with, last week you were working with, last week you were marrying. You have to patrol them. And every European man could be conscripted to patrol these newly minted slaves, because now they were slaves. And over the course of the next 50 to 100 years, race evolved in some prototypical form as we know it today. And I say prototypical because race has continued to evolve. So the way we think about and did race in the colonies is no longer the way we do race today. And race is a set of practices that I'll get to in a minute. But I want to linger here just for another minute. Because what was going on, which most students of history continue to miss, this wasn't simply the distribution of goods and services. This was the distribution of identity. This was the creation of white identity in the early colonies. And the white identity, which still haunts us today, was that of a middle stratum. The stratum of identifying with the elites and policing the racially non-elites. Policing the racially non-elites. So you want to think about Ferguson? That's where it started. The idea of policing the other. They don't belong. They're different than us. This is also the foundation of the American dilemma. And so there are classes of people, some who are more or less members and some who are not. And that contradiction continues to haunt us today. So in that effort of policing the other, which has worked so well, we constructed white identity. And that identity is deeply embedded with violence, with othering, and with policing. Now again, it took a long time to get there. People didn't just flip the switch. One week, we're working the fields together. The next week, I'm policing you. So there were a number of laws, there were a number of practices, there were fights back and forth. The anti-miscegenation laws, which came online about 1690. And we call them anti-miscegenation laws, but they really were not anti-miscegenation laws in any broad sense. Because, again, the elites didn't care if blacks by now married Indians or Mexicans, or it was only about whites. It was only creating this special place for whites. And whites would get punished if they continued to marry and intermingle with the racial other, which they did for several decades, which is also counterintuitive. We now think, of course, people naturally want to be with themselves. And we think there's a natural group of folks out there. Our groups are constituted and reconstituted and reconstituted. There are no natural groups. There's no natural groups for whites because there are no natural whites. There are no natural groups for blacks because there are no natural blacks. All of that is a matter of social constitution. Social constitution, not individual constitution, which is one of the mistakes we make, is that I can individually decide my identity. Our identities are always in relationship to each other, structures, and practice. And so we really are going to shift our identity. We have to think about those relationships with each other, the structures, and the practice. So let's come up another couple of hundred years. The country is forming, and we have the Declaration of Independence, and then we have the Constitution. If you think about the formation of the country at the beginning of the Constitution, we had Congress divided into two sections, not Democrats and Republicans. One half were for those who supported slavery, the other half was for those who opposed it. That was the divide in the country up to the Civil War. The most pressing question in terms of political filter was, are you for or against slavery? And every institution that was brought into being prior to the Civil War had to actually go through that crucible, which means that all of our deep institutional groundings were heavily racialized. So think of something like the Electoral College, which we live with today. The Electoral College was in part a racialized system. We have a system where the South is going to come into the Union. They want to make sure that they have parity with the North. They don't have as many people. So they come up with this ingenious plan. We are going to count the slaves, who everybody knows is not really people. We're going to count them for the purpose of adding to our leisure the number of people in our state. It's called the 3/5 clause. And some people get confused and they say slaves were only considered 3/5 of a person. Slaves were not considered a person at all. It was the slave master that actually was enhanced by counting the slave, not the slave. And it created relative parity between the North and South. And so the first several presidents, including Jefferson, would not have won without the 3/5 clause. The 3/5 clause stacked the deck in favor of the South, and using the institution of slavery to do that. Now, I could do this with all the institutions, and this has actually been done by two authors, a number of authors, but Alcina and Glaser, in a book called Fighting Poverty in the United States and Europe, A World of Difference. And they talk about American exceptionalism. What actually produced that exceptionalism? How does that exceptionalism actually express itself? And one of the things they say is that when you look at the exceptionalism, not just in terms of our stingy welfare program, not just our exceptionalism in terms of our possessive individualism, not just our exceptionalism in terms of our racial brawling, but our exceptionalism in terms of our institutions themselves, states' rights, federalism, winner takes all, the role of the Supreme Court. They say all of these can only be understood through the lens of race. Now, this is important because when we think of race, we think about, oftentimes, we default to, when we talk about race, we're talking about black people. Maybe we're talking about Latinos, maybe we're talking about Native Americans or Asians, but mainly we're talking about black people when we say race. That's the thought. You say race, people think black people. And you always get the question, I always get the question, why are we even talking about race anymore? Aren't we beyond that? We don't have to see race, and now there are all these people who are not black. They're not white, but they're not black, so can we talk about something else? It's not simply a question of conversation. If you look at our institutional design, how we structure our institutions, how our institutions are different than any other country on the planet, you simply can't understand it without understanding race. So when we talk about race, we're not talking about what black people get. You all are affected by the Electoral College, everyone in here. It's a racialized system. So let me give you a more recent example of that. There's a book by Ira Katznelson, and those of you who are academics will recognize him as a heavyweight. He's a very careful social scientist. And some of you, like my friend Connie Heller, have struggled through 700 pages of his books as he talks about fear itself and how fear help frame our culture and institutions in some fundamental ways that all of us live with. So he says that there are three primary fears at the time. He talked about war, he talked about the economy, but he also talked about the fear in terms of race. And he says this fear helped shape everything from the 1930s on. So what's an example of that? In the 1930s, during the Great Depression, and then during the Marshall Plan, the government was dealing with high unemployment. It decided to create jobs. We all know the Public Works Program. It literally created thousands of jobs. It built roads, it built bridges, and it put America back to work. But then something happened. The South was concerned because the Public Works Program didn't adhere to Jim Crow. It didn't adhere to the idea that whites always have to be on top. And so the South basically said, you can never do that again. The government can never be in the business of actually creating jobs. It redefined the role of government as outside creating jobs. So when we had the Great Recession, even when we had Democrats controlling both houses and the presidency, we couldn't talk about the government actually creating jobs. What Cass Nelson says is that logic of the government not having a role in creating jobs is a racialized logic that can be traced back to the 1930s and 40s. Again, most of us don't know that. We think, oh yeah, the government can't create jobs. That's not the government's job. Every other government on the planet will create jobs, but except for ours. So my point that I want to drive home to you is when we talk about race, we're not talking about a discrete number of people. We're talking about America. We're talking about the structure of America. We're talking about who we are. And it goes up and down. It doesn't move in one direction. So we just had an election. And I talked about this middle stratum, whites being the middle stratum, which is also very important because we're not talking about whites versus non-whites. We're talking about a middle stratum, then people who are not in the middle stratum, and the elites. So the idea of focusing on the 1% didn't come from Occupy. It was already there. The elites were already there. And when the elites actually gave birth to this concept of whiteness, they did not count themselves as white. When they said, you can't marry across racial lines, they were not talking about themselves. There's no way they were going to marry anyone who was not elite at all. So when you read the story of Pocahontas, read it from the point of view that one elite marrying another elite. So, oh, isn't that nice, interracial relationship? They're not dealing with race. Elites to elites. Race, that's something the rest of y'all got. We got something else called status and power. The middle stratum, separate, dominating non-whites, allegiance to the elites. So think about this election. Who won? I would say black people didn't win. I would say Native Americans didn't win. I would say Latinos didn't win. I would say Hispanics didn't win. Did white people win? No. Well, who won? The elites. The elites won. The question is, how did they win? Because there are only about 400 billionaires in the country. How is it that they can galvanize the country and win an election? Why are the Tea Party, who are middle class but not elites, why are they so obsessed with shrinking the government? Where does that come from? Okay, a little bit more history. So there's a period of time where the dominant power in the country was situated in the elites. We called it the Gilded Age. We call it the age of the robber barons, where there was extreme inequality. And the country was embroiled in all kinds of fights, the populist movement, the progressive movement, Teddy Roosevelt, where there was this huge fight with the robber barons. And the fight went on for a long time. And during most of that time, the elites won. And then there was this thing called the Great Depression, the crash. And it opened up a window to actually challenge the elites. And Roosevelt took the challenge. And out of that came the New Deal. And so the New Deal was the first real national expression of limiting the prerogative of the elites.